Welcome back everyone to another Kaiserreich progress report. This one is the number 67 and I will be doing a video about it because it's actually pretty important. Now I won't be bantering all that much today because I do have a kind of sore throat, so yeah, you can probably hear that my voice is not exactly at its best, but we'll do our best and go through with this because it's actually kind of interesting. So what they're doing is they're reworking some of the tech tree. Specifically, they're revealing the Naval Tech Tree rework, and I kind of like their reasons to do this because what they're saying is essentially, since this is an alternate history, it is conceivable that technology would have developed in some kind of different way, especially for the navies of the world, because I'm not sure how much you know about the history of navies after World War I, but they were actively kind of influenced by many things which in the world of Kaiserreich simply don't exist. So yeah, it is quite a bit different, as they say. Essentially, they decided that it would go down quite a different one in terms of the path of naval development. So our world had the Naval Treaties, so like the Treaty of Washington, Treaty of London, that limited the amount and the tonnage of capital ships for every major navy, essentially. And they also limited per ship, the armament and the tonnage. So what you have is, except for people who break the treaty later on, such as the Japanese and the Italians, what you have is that you have either some ships that were already in construction that then are essentially illegal by the treaties, and so those get converted into aircraft carriers. We're talking about battleships here. And then you have other ships that were planned that are not built, so you don't have another naval arms race like you do in the teens of the 1900s. From about 1900 to 1914, you have the race for the dreadnoughts between the British, the Americans, and the Germans, and slightly to the side the Japanese as well, but they're kind of a different horse. So since that kind of thing did not repeat itself, you have that the navies are a lot more tame in a way in terms of the number of capital ships, but they have different kinds of technical developments that in the world of Kaiserreich don't happen yet. So what you have is, well, first of all, since there is no limit on the amount of capital ships that these countries can have, many of the older ships are not scrapped because, of course, if you're going to be, if you can only have, like, for example, 6 battleships, you're going to want to have the newest ones, and so you're going to scrap your older ones. Well, as a fact, this is the case. So the amount of ships that countries will have at the start, the order of battle, will be much different. Especially for people like Germany, the Americans, in some ways the British, in some ways the French. You can see the screenshot that I'll be referring to every once in a while. So yeah, you have that, and then you have other ships that in our timeline were never completed because of several reasons, and in here they're complete. And they redid the tech tree because they wanted to allow essentially for the different progress of tech that they're envisioning for a world like Kaiserreich. So as you can see, this is the new tech tree. It's also got some extra of course, in Kaiserreich it's Weltkrieg, but pre-Great War techs in Hearts of Iron 4 normal, you only have the 1918 tech, obviously. But in here you go all the way to 1900 because, again, that's representing a lot of older ships being kept in service by certain navies. In fact, by a lot of navies, because why the hell wouldn't you have them if you're just trying to outrace the other guys anyway? So, yeah, you have just your normal destroyers, just like in real life, except they're generally leaning more on the heavy side and the big side, which is kind of what happened in real life as well. You have the Japanese Fubuki class, you have the American Fletchers. Destroyers just tended to get bigger over time, at least the line destroyers. Then you have the escort destroyers, which is a whole other thing, but that's not what we're talking about right now. For cruisers, you only have cruisers and armored cruisers. Essentially, in real life, these two ships developed into heavy cruisers and light cruisers. Because again, you have that certain ships were limited. And so you don't really have the need for a kind of really big cruiser. What you need your cruisers for in our timeline is to kind of keep smaller ships at bay or lead smaller ships in the case of light cruisers. In this kind of timeline, however, you need more firepower because everyone's just sporting around bigger guns. So what you have is that your cruisers, which are what eventually became light cruisers, instead become essentially what the heavy cruisers in our timeline became. So, you know, a heavy gunship with not much armor and relative speed. And then you have the armored cruisers, which become essentially the pocket battleships, which in real life only the Germans employed, but it's essentially like if you can't afford a bigger battleship, you have a pocket battleship. It's got less guns, it's got less armor, but it's still there. It can still pack quite a punch. Then you have the battle cruiser, which in real life essentially just was phased out of most navies after World War I due to many reasons, except for the Japanese that classified some of their ships as battle cruisers, but in reality they had been essentially rebuilt into battleships. So it's not really the most accurate thing. In this timeline, they do stay alive, and they're essentially become what in our timeline become the fast battleships. So like the Iowa class, and you know, the King George V, for example, or the Bismarck, for example. Then you have the battleships that essentially are a bit of a halfway between our timeline's regular battleships and then the bigger projects of battleships that were envisioned or sometimes even built in the case of the Yamato and Musashi by the Japanese. You know, like the Montanas, the all the Z-Plan battleships that I don't remember the name of, all those kinds of things. The Lion and the Vanguard for the British, and yeah, those kinds of ships. That's because essentially they explain this further in down here, but what you have is that by the end of World War I, essentially everyone's trying to win the dreadnought race, and so they build a bunch of really, really big ships, essentially at the end of the First World War, which in real life did not happen. And so what you have is that you have a kind of scale to these battleships in the interwar years that is vastly different from what it used to be. However, their technology, as we will see, is of course still that of World War I ships. And so in the later tiers, these battleships become a little bit less monstrosities and try to sometimes scale back a little bit due to many reasons, one of them being the fuel usage, as we will see. Then for carriers, we have Seaplane Carrier, which is added in as a bit of an extra. And I'm guessing that they're going to have special planes, maybe, who knows. Then you have normal aircraft carriers, and then you have heavy aircraft carriers. So what you have is that the heavy aircraft carriers are some of these bigger dreadnoughts that are built by some of these countries that, for one reason or another, have to be converted into an aircraft carrier, just like they were in real life. But it is to be said that most starting navies, for example, you can see the Hochseeflotte over here to the left, it's only got one aircraft carrier at the start, which is actually different from the current patch, which includes way too many carriers for the Kriegsmarine, but that's fine. And except for the British, the Japanese, and the Americans, you don't really have major navies with a lot of aircraft carriers because, again, they were all, even more than in real life, focused on the battleship and really that kind of race. And the reason a heavy carrier exists is actually because of the British, but it's kind of got an interesting lore that they built up into it. And then you have submarines, of course. What they're going to do is they're going to kind of rework the balance. They're going to kind of rework the balance of the naval combat to make destroyers and cruisers more useful, as well as submarines more useful. So they're essentially going to be making it sure that you can't just build capital ships and then kind of hope to win just by having meat shield escorts. You're going to need a more balanced fleet, and you're going to need to have submarines as well, which right now you don't. And yeah, of course, they're going to have some rebalancing as well to the way some of the aircraft carriers work, you know, all that kind of stuff. So if we go down, they put up a few screenshots of battles. You can see that there's all the different kinds of new ships that are fighting each other, and yeah, that is a lot of dreadnoughts that the Germans have, as you can see. 12 dreadnoughts. So the Germans are going to be quite scary because of the amount of battleships that they have. And yeah, so more screenshots of battles, even one between ships that don't have perhaps quite a strong you know, surface combatants. As you can see, the Egyptians and the Ottomans, although the Ottomans easily winning this fight, probably thanks to their battleships. If we go down, they explain the dreadnought race, which again, essentially, at the end of the war, everyone's trying to like desperately build up ships. The British kind of outspend their own capacity, and that contributes to their revolution. When the revolution happens, a lot of their essentially vessels that they were building either get scrapped or in some way converted, or you know, the instability makes it essentially useless for them to be completed, all that kind of stuff. So the Germans shoot ahead of the British momentarily, in a way, but the British respond by investing heavily into aircraft carriers. Then outside of Europe, both the Americans and the Japanese are very, very concerned about this, but their economy doesn't really allow them to build up quite as much, although the Americans do build up quite a lot. Of course, they're going to have the Civil War, so their fleet splits up, which leaves Germany mostly as kind of like the quote-unquote winner, but Germany is only the winner because he is the last man standing, not because he actually won, in a way. And yeah, the Japanese, I don't have the voice to talk about it, but it's actually very interesting. You should go ahead and read. There's a book called Kaigun that explains essentially how the Japanese Navy was thinking about its development from the 1860s all the way to essentially the Second World War. And it kind of tells you how they were perceiving global threats up against them. And let's just say that these guys were paranoid as hell, so it's kind of funny that they're going to be including some of these dynamics into what the Japanese Navy is going to look like in the next patch. Although they, unlike the French, British, and German fleets, they haven't provided a screenshot as to what the Japanese fleet will look like. So as you can see, this is the graphical rework. And yeah, as I said, you have bigger ships than in real life, so that's also going to be kind of playing into, you know, people who like big battleships, and I do like big battleships. Who doesn't? It's kind of a fun thing. And yeah, you can see like the kind of size comparisons between these at the top are essentially the World War I dreadnoughts that in some cases go ahead and serve in World War II and become some of the main battle wagons for some countries, such as the Queen Elizabeth for the British, as opposed to what kinds of monsters they're building throughout the interwars, or out, you know, at the early interwars. So you have the Germans essentially almost doubling the size of their battleship, up to the Kaiser Wilhelm, which is just absolutely massive. And the Japanese essentially building the Yamato a little bit earlier. They've stated that these ships are essentially sporting 18-inch guns just by default, which is what the Yamato had in real life, and that was, you know, the absolute maximum high end. Only the Yamato class has ever had 18-inch guns, you know, guns so big. And then you have the battlecruisers with 16-inch guns, which are essentially the ones that become the standard for battleships in our world during the Second World War. So you have, you know, the Iowas, the King George V, the Roma, the, you know, Littorio, Roma, Italian battleships, all with 16 inchers, but in here they become kind of even a small gun, quote unquote, kind of like what 14-inch would be in real life. And yeah, so battleships are bigger, battlecruisers are bigger, and why do I have this twice? I do not know. So yeah, essentially Germany is strong, but maybe they're kind of a paper tiger, because again, the British are investing heavily in aircraft carriers, so who knows. And yeah, another thing that they're going to be kind of keeping an eye on is Man the Guns, because of course Man the Guns is going to be coming out eventually. And they're doing a naval rework when the Paradox Interactive Studio is about to publish their own naval rework. Of course, their own naval rework is going to be 20 euros or 20 US dollars, so go figure. And what they're saying essentially is that I think it's a very, very sensible opinion and rational opinion. It's just, if there's good features, they're going to try to integrate them. If not, they're going to keep on doing what they're doing. And I like that kind of attitude because, hey, do what works best for your project. I guess that kind of makes sense. So TLDR, the naval rework contains a brand new tech tree, a completely redone fleets for all nations, so starting fleets will be different. I wonder if the South Americans will have different fleets, because that would be interesting. New graphics, rebalanced stats, and new naval decisions for all nations, which is kind of cool. So that's going to be the end of the overview. Sorry for my kind of somber mood, but it's the way it is. And this rework is going to be coming out in the next patch. So yeah, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you've enjoyed. Hope I'll see you soon, and have a good day.